According to the cloud. My name is Victor Volkman, and I am the current president of the Upper Peninsula Publishers and Authors Association. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in this evening. Now, this evening, we have Deborah Frontiera, who is going to be talking about the importance of setting and how you can take advantage of it to improve the quality of your writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. Now, Deborah grew up in Western UP, and from 1985 through 2008, she taught in inner city public schools in Houston, Texas. This was followed by several years in Houston's WITS, Writers in the Schools program, where she was a writer in residence at several elementary schools, guiding young people in creative writing. Several of her books have been honor or award winners. She has published fiction, nonfiction, poetry, children's books, and numerous articles for the Marquette Monthly. She also is the current editor of the newsletter for the Upper Peninsula Publishers and Authors Association. And for fun, she enjoys hiking, swimming, kayaking, and reading. All right, thank you, Debbie. Take it away.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. It's good to see some familiar faces and see some new faces too. I have done so many different kinds of setting that I felt like this is something that I could share and help people with at looking at different ways to describe setting and to use setting. If any of you go back and you still read the classics and things that were written in say the 1800s and even through the beginning of the 20th century, so many novelists had these long, detailed pages over pages over pages describing the setting, almost to the point where you want to throw the book across the room because you want to get on with the story. But back then it was really important to have all that description because most people didn't know the world beyond 20 miles from where they lived. And so it was necessary to go into great detail in describing their setting and characters and one thing and another. Now we have so much familiarity with what it looks like in China or Hawaii or Russia or Western Europe or South America or whatever. We know that because of the internet. Writers do not need to spend near as much time on that. And we can use other techniques besides straight out description to do some of that. Even if you look at some, well, I don't know, this isn't so contemporary anymore, but if anybody saw the movie several years ago, New in Town, the plot involved this young woman climbing the corporate ladder and being transferred from sunny Florida to outskirts of Minneapolis in the dead of winter. And there's one particular scene in that movie that I love for the way they brought up the setting. It shows her getting her luggage at the Minneapolis airport. And all you see is people from the waist down. And you look at snowmobile suits and mucklucks and, you know, heavy winter gear and all of this stuff. And she's standing in there in this short little mini skirt with hose and spiky heels and a little short jacket that looks like it just goes with a suit. And if you're from the north, you're already laughing because you know what's going to happen when she walks out the door. And if you're not from the north, you are struck by the contrast and you just have the idea that something very funny is going to follow. And of course it does when she walks out the door and starts cursing because it's that cold. Cold actually becomes a character in that movie, and it keeps coming up and coming up and coming up. And it's used in a very, very creative way. When I look at setting, I use so many different techniques that I'm going to share with you in different books that sometimes I meet myself coming and going. I want to start with historical fiction and with my book, Living on Sisu, which is middle grade historical fiction that has been adopted by many adults. I used a lot of different techniques in this. For one thing, I used a journal style of writing it. And I used a lot of photographs. You can see even the cover has a historical photograph that helps with the setting, with the people marching and with the young woman on the side who became the model for my main character. And the feeling you get when you see the way her hand is up to her mouth, like what horrible thing is going to happen today. I used a lot of different kinds of dialogue and writing to do this. And one short passage that I want to read is from August of that month. And she says, "My feelings have been so mixed up lately. It is something like this. When I was little, I used to run down the grassy side of our hill for the joy of feeling the wind in my face, almost like I was flying. I saw only the green grass and smelled the sweet clover as I tumbled down at the bottom. Nowadays, I drag my way back up Bridge Street, and all I see are dingy gray houses. I wish I could be a little girl again. But Mother Jones' speeches and the parades the last 2 days have helped me see that things can be both gray and green." So in that, I used the symbolism and the colors and that memory to let you know that she's in a very dark place right now and very discouraged and worried about her future. Another thing that I did with the photos, and I don't know how well this one is going to show up, I found this tremendous winter photograph taken on 5th Street in Calumet. And it just, the starking contrast of how high this man is standing on the bank that's the middle of the road with the sleigh. And when you're actually looking at it in the book, you can see the horse's breath, and it just screams cold. And by using dialogue, description, my character's feelings, I put across what it was like to be a young girl back in 1913 in the middle of a strike. And I did that throughout the book and won an award, which made me feel really good because of the tremendous amount of research that I did in that. And I want to share one other little story from living on Sisu. I did a lot of walking all around the whole Calumet Laurium area just to see how long it took to get from one place to another on foot, because that was how people got around back then, especially the poor and especially the miners who didn't have horses, didn't have carriages, and they were lucky if they had a dime for the trolley. One of the things I found in research was that so many towns had little shortcuts here and there, down an alley, across a field, one way or another, faster ways of getting from point A to point B. And even when I was growing up in Lake Linden in the 50s and 60s, we had shortcuts everywhere. So it stood to reason that there would be a shortcut from Swedetown, which is a little bit outside of Calumet proper, into the main part of town and over to where Mine Street was with all of the shafts. But I couldn't find any historical evidence that there was actually such a shortcut. I just figured it had to be there because everything else had shortcuts. And even one of the main conflicts of the strike happened when 2 strikers in South Range were walking across a shortcut that happened to go across company land, and then they got arrested for trespassing because they were strikers. And so I went on and I described this shortcut between Swedetown and the rest of Calumet, even though I wasn't positive it was there. The first year the book was out, I was in Calumet at Pasty Fest in the park with my little booth, and this guy came up to ask me to sign the copy of the book that he'd bought earlier. And he said, "I couldn't believe it. You even got the shortcut from Swedetown to Calumet." And I'm inside, I'm going, "Whew, it really is there, or was there," you know, and I said, "Yeah." You know, so these little things come up, you know, now and then when you know you got it right, and it gives you that great feeling of satisfaction. When you write contemporary fiction, you don't have quite as much of a problem with setting. It helps if you are set in a specific town or region. It's always nice for the people in that region if you mention a particular street name or a particular business, and for others that makes the setting come more alive. But if you're just talking in general, and this is what I did in my little modern fantasy, Midnight in the Pawn Shop, where all the stuff in the pawn shop comes to life at night. I had a really good time describing that because it's fun to give character, personality, and backstory to objects. And I want to read just a little bit from the introduction, because an introduction is a really good way to introduce fantasy. And in this one, I did it in first person from the point of view of my narrator. I've been up in this corner of the pawn shop a good many years, rotating automatically between the door and the place where the customers stand at the counter. I catch their faces and sometimes their names. I choose not to talk, but I always think and record it so it can be played back if anyone ever needed it or wanted to. It hasn't been a boring existence, but usually not all that exciting either. I suppose other security cameras do the same, but I've never met another one to compare my experiences to theirs. If you must have a name, it's Security Camera Model 427, or SC427 for short. Maybe a month ago, there was a tremendous thunderstorm, at midnight, of course. One lightning strike was so close it made all the wires in the building sizzle, but I didn't go out because of my battery. Something strange happened after that lightning strike. Everything in the place came to life. I suppose they all had some sort of inner life prior to that and could think and remember and watch what happened around them in some way, but never before that night had any of them ever said anything, anytime, at least not on my watch. And then it goes on into the stories of all of these objects, which the security camera is recording. And by doing that, I not only had fun with it, I played with cliches. I mean, it's at midnight, of course. And there's a break-in where all kinds of cliche stuff kinds of happens. And I rather played up on that just for the fun of it, and went on to create that whole setting that way. I had been in and out of 3 or 4 different pawn shops just to see how they were laid out, talked to some managers, looked at what items pawn shops generally have in common. There's always a guitar hanging on the wall. There's always jewelry. There's always old model electronic stuff, TVs, sometimes books, and then some things would be rather unique to one shop after another, so that as I could talk about pawn shops in general, it sounded like any pawn shop that you might walk into anywhere. And so using that introduction really helped set the fact that, okay, we got talking stuff here. We're outside of the real world, but we're still in the real world. And that was a different kind of challenge for me, and I had a lot of fun with it. And I've done a lot since with bringing inanimate objects to life. When you get into total fantasy and you're creating a whole alternative universe, you have to do a lot more in-depth thinking. And when I wrote my fantasies, The Chronicles of Henry Roach Derrier, which is a future world beyond people, think Planet of the Ants instead of Planet of the Apes, where my characters are digging up humanity the way we dig up dinosaur bones and trying to figure out what happened to these creatures that they call the duopods, or Duopod erectus to be totally correct. And I had fun with Latin terminology there. I had to come up with a whole new world, and I had to have it enough human that my readers could tap into it, but enough non-human that it was true to an insect universe instead of a human universe. Does that make sense? So you have to think about all aspects of culture. I had to plan out, at least in my mind, what kind of a social structure they had, what kind of government, what kind of law enforcement, what kind of religion, how are they going to interact socially, what kind of educational systems are they going to have. And even though I didn't use everything in the first novel, I had to describe it in a way that from context, my my readers could figure out this alternative universe. And again, I turned to an introduction, and I made that introduction my aunt's myth of creation, which also had to account for another intelligent species that came before they did. In thinking about a myth, of course, that's going to involve some type of religion. I had to come up with, okay, what kind of a god would ants have? Would it be male or female? Because it just doesn't work for God. And for there, I went to different human cultures and did a lot of reading. Christianity, Judaism, Islam are all based in male-dominated societies, and they are all revealed religions. And it made sense for a male-dominated society to refer to God as he. But ants are a giant sisterhood. They're all daughters of the same queen. And even though I had involved them to have family structures and, you know, male and female rather than just one queen and they're all daughters of the same queen, I evolved them out of that. But it still made sense that their deity would be referred to as she. I also did a lot of reading of different human mythology on where the difference between good and evil, how evil entered the world. I went back and I read Genesis in the Bible, and I read the wonderful work of C.S. Lewis, where Aslan calls Narnia into being with a song. If any of you have not read that, it is the most beautiful piece of allegory I've ever read. I don't think mine's as good as he is, but it was a beautiful piece of allegory. And then I read other myths in 20 other human cultures regarding whether they were monotheistic or polytheistic, whether the gods were male, female, or both, and all of that. And I looked at how they had evil into their world. And I came up with a myth that fit what I was doing in this future world. And that myth is at the beginning of of each of the 4 volumes, so that the first thing you read is this myth, and it puts you into the world I created. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because it takes about 10 minutes, but you'll get the idea. The beginning, as revealed to Daira Derrier in dreams and meditation. In the beginning, essence roamed the skies looking for the right place to start a world. She saw that our planet already had cycles of day and night, water and air. It had a set path around its sun, so its cycles could be numbered, but it had no life. I will see what can live and grow here, she said, and joined herself with it. The creative life force of essence endowed the waters with minuscule plants and creatures, and the cycle of life began. Essence cherished this new life, but was tired from her journey across the cosmos, so she entered the earth and went to sleep. Eons later, when she woke, the planet was filled with life forms. The water and air and land teemed with a great variety of plants and creatures. Some were tiny and frail, others huge and fierce. There were a great variety in their outer coverings, smooth, hard, scaly, furry. The large, scaly ones dominated at that time. Essence watched her world. The sun fed the plants, which fed the moving creatures, who then were eaten by larger ones, and on and on. They grew, propagated, and returned to feed the earth when their time was over. Some creatures failed and disappeared, but new ones evolved to take their place. And ants were there. Essence, filled with the balance and cycles, cradled her world and went to sleep again. The pain of many shocks woke Essence. Chunks of matter hurled through the cosmos struck the planet, killing millions of life forms and knocking the planet in its cosmic path. The dust from their impact screened the sun's light, denying energy-giving life to plants. Essence watched in dismay as thousands of species disappeared from her cherished world. In her grief, she shook. Hills tumbled. Mountains sent forth liquid fire from within. But even in grief, Essence's creative life force found its way again. An infinite variety of flowering plants came to be. A few species of the scaly creatures and some of the small ones with fur and feathers survived. And then I go on to go through the various stages of human evolution or not human evolution, but Earth's evolution through geologic time, the various mass extinctions that occurred and how ants were there through all of it. And then bringing it up to their present day time. This helped my readers understand where I was going with it. And then at the very end, after humanity has failed and Essence is just beyond herself with grief because she gave these creatures intelligence and they blew it. And so she turns and she says, "Ah, my faithful ants, you have always been with me from the earliest days and have always been civilized. Perhaps the intelligence I gave the duopods was not enough. I will try again. I will give you not only the gift of knowledge, but my compassion as well. And this time I will not sleep, but will watch over my world. I will be available to my creatures, speaking to their minds when they seek me. When each one's time on earth is done, the part of me that is in them will return to me in unity forever. Eat then, my ants, of the lasting creation of the duopods, plastic, and receive my gifts. Cherish my world and seek to understand its mysteries." And so we are. While Essence was speaking, a group of roaches approached. They took the gift of intelligence, but ran away before the second, more important gift of compassion and inner essence was given. Thus, they received no more of Essence than had the extinct duopods. Bemused, Essence observed the roaches as they ran from her. I must watch and see what comes of this development. And then I open with the novel so that you have an idea. There's a difference between these two cultures, and that starts from the very beginning of it. I also have to admit that myth, writing that myth, was the last thing I added to the novel because so many of my critique buddies and beta readers were confused by the world I was trying to create. And I said, okay, I got to get this cleared up. I got to get this right from the start. And then decided on the myth to accomplish that. Any questions so far? I revealed different parts of the culture within each book. In this one, To Build a Tunnel, plastic mining comes to light, especially Rocherian plastic mining, and why they want a couple of ants to teach them how to build better tunnels, because the ants are good at it and they're not. And so I opened this scene with a description of a plastic mine disaster and a bit of description about how Rocheria did its plastic mining. Young Rex Roach hurried toward the entrance of the #1 plastic mine. It was owned by his father, Sir Rudy, an influential member of the Southeast Roach Control Board, the governing body of organized Rocheria. Several mine workers frantically attempted to clear debris from the tunnel's entrance. Rocherian plastic mining was a half scientific, half luck affair. Plastic would be found on the surface and scavenged. When it was gone, digging would begin. The hole would be enlarged and deepened until the pit resembled a huge bowl-shaped scar in the planet's surface, sometimes 2,000 F-units in diameter. The depth varied greatly from one location to another. Tunnels would be dug into the slopes as needed. This particular mine had begun on the side of the slope, so its pit was comparatively small and its tunnel system much more extensive. A confused noise of wailing and questions came from several female roaches wandering about, searching for their mates and sons to see if they had gotten out before the tunnel caved in. Rex approached the workers. "Where's Gabriel? Did he get out?" "Yes, sir, he's over there resting," replied the overseer. Rex moved toward where the mine tunnel digger reclined on the ground, front paws on his head, moaning. Parts of his back were covered with mud, but Rex could see no obvious injury, which relieved him. Gabriel was not a great tunnel digger, but he was the best available in the area. what maggot muck happened, Gabriel? And you can see what fun I had with expletives, making them not human, but still getting the point across. I hope you're getting a feeling for, yeah, I grew up in the copper country. I know copper mining. I know mine disasters. But can you see from that bit of description how I used some description and some dialogue and even an expletive to set the tone for what my roaches are like?
Yeah, I can really see in my mind's eye the whole setting, and the colors, the textures, and action.
Right. And yet I didn't sit there and go on for pages about it. And that's
Yeah.
the thing that we have to be careful with these days. By the time I got to the fourth book, my society was very developed. They had figured out what happened to us because the archaeologists had dug up key things that, of course, I left there for them. And by book 4, after they know what happened to us, they know what our measurement systems were. I could let my narrator, who is the grandson of my original narrator, I could let him editorialize just a little bit about the differences between human culture and roach culture. Following the myth, I let Henry describe what he knows and what he thinks about our present system. Measuring time and distance. My great-great-grandmother, Master Henrietta, the first to understand the writings of the extinct duopods, unraveled some rather unusual things about the measurement systems of those highly intelligent creatures. While they, like we, found that a season cycle had 365 days and divided those days into 52 quarter time frames of 7 days each, their beginning of each new season cycle has always seemed a bit odd to me. Their time frames varied from 28 to 31 days each, and they had just 12 such time frames. Ours makes much more scientific sense, 13 time frames of 28 days each, and then last day, which is winter solstice. It's not part of any time frame, nor is it part of a quarter time frame. Last day simply is. Then we begin a new year on what the duopods called December 22. Our summer solstice celebration, falling exactly halfway through our season cycle, is always the 14th of 7th time frame, with extra day falling right before it every 4th season cycle. Again, not part of any quarter time frame, but simply there. But summer solstice fell on what the duopods called June 21. Such important calendar dates on completely non-logical days. Lastly, the duopods gave strange names to their days of the quarter time frame. Monday, Tuesday, our first day, second day, third day are ever so much simpler. The duopod word for H unit, hour, was more similar to what we call it, but they had a strange way of measuring distance. The number of F units, 5,280 to be precise, made up a mile. Our D unit is close to that in distance, and even 5,000 F units. Other duopods used completely different units in tens, hundreds, and thousands. They referred to as metric. Why didn't they simply have one system? I've asked that of some of our archaeologists, but as of this writing, they don't really have an answer. So again, I have fun playing off the social satire of comparing their culture to ours and looking at our culture through a completely different lens. And then still developing characters and dialogue that go along with that and revealing it in short passages. I got to flip my page here. I don't want to skip something that I intended to talk about. Sometimes I also used a story within a story or a character's backstory to reveal that setting. Let's see, where's one of the things that I did in this? This is a contrast in the way 2 ants emerged into adulthood. Now, as you know, ants have a pupate stage. They don't go infant, child, adult. They go egg, larva, pupa, adult. So my ants don't really have much of a memory until they reach adulthood. It's just sort of subconscious. And here is how my main character in New South Theory 50 emerges from pupation. Anthony Derrier awoke from his long pupate sleep and found himself in total darkness. He reached up instinctively and pulled a feeding tube from his mouth, discovered he had legs, and rolled over onto them. He kicked something that went clattering about. He stretched and said, "That's better," and was surprised by the sound of his own voice. He turned his head from side to side, let his antennae find a way out of the chamber, and moved toward the portal, fumbled with the latch, and finally pushed it open. Before him was a large, softly lit chamber. It seemed familiar, though he could remember nothing certain. He sensed that there should be other creatures around, but the chamber was empty. "I'm here," he shouted. No answer. His confusion increased. He froze, shaking, unable to think of what he was supposed to do. He had no idea how long he stood there. It seemed like an eternity. His anxiety increased with every moment. With a click and a scraping noise, the portal on the opposite side of the chamber opened and someone entered. She was carrying a wiggling white thing. The blast of light blinded Anthony. He raised his front paws to his face and cried out, "Ah!" He heard a voice. "Anthony, you've emerged, and I wasn't here. How awful." She put the white thing in an oval basket. Caring pods surrounded him, stroked him, held him. The voice, which now seemed familiar, continued, "I'm so sorry. I'm your mother. We hadn't expected you to emerge for another half a time frame. I would never have left the mound if I thought you were ready. It must have been dreadful to find no one here to greet you." So this was an unusual occurrence. The If you just totally lost a train of thought. The co-main character in this had a totally different emerging. And she is Henrietta. And she is the one who figures out how to read our writing much later. And this one starts with a conference during which I let you know a little about the way ants educate their young. Master Adriana, the assistant director of the Science and Technology Training Facility at South Harvester Colony 45, greeted Henrietta Harvester. "It's good to see you again, Henrietta. I hope you won't mind a short wait. Your problem-solving trainer would like to join us. Would you like a mug of warm honeydew?" "Yes, please. I don't mind waiting," replied Henrietta. Henrietta sipped the honeydew and thought of some of the events of her first season cycle of adulthood. She remembered her father's fond greeting when she opened the portal of her pupate chamber. He told her she was the oldest of 4. Her next younger sister, Hilda, was 3 season cycles younger and pupating. Annie and Andrew were still larvae, 5 season cycles and 1 season cycle old. And then it goes on from there. So there's a very difference between these two main characters emerged. And then the rest of that scene involves the description of how the ants educate their young, how they choose their careers and things like that. And it's done through the dialogue of this conference between Henrietta and the principal and one of her teachers, only I gave them very different names. So through scenes like that, I would reveal other parts of the society of the world I created that were important to the plot. Now, when I read the passage about time and calendars, you notice I mentioned what they did in leap year and what they did in for their last day, that 365th day. And those things never actually entered until the second book that I wrote, where what their last day's service is like. It's a very religious thing among the ants. And I didn't need it in the first book, so I never went into it. I have yet to have a leap year celebration. In one of the books, no, two of them, I go into this party festival that they have for summer solstice, but it didn't enter into the other two at all. So I didn't use it. So even though everything you create is up here in your mind and you know what you're going to do if you do need it, you don't put those elements in unless they're relevant to the plot you're working with. Does that make sense? Okay, I hope so. If there's a question on that, please shoot, you know, hit the raise button or unmute yourself anytime. A lot of social satire came into the third book of the trilogy, which deals mostly with life in Rocheria. And there I had more comparisons to human, not sociology, it's not the word I want, human life, prejudices and one thing and another. And to give that stark contrast between my aunts who are communal, make sure everybody's working, everybody has what they need, take care of each other, not communism with a capital C, the political jargon, but communalism in the sense of common ownership of everything and everybody working for the common good rather than for selfish needs. Does that make sense? And now Henry, my title character, because book 3 is his young adulthood, we have an idea of what goes on in part of Rocheria. And this is a scene where Henry arrives in Rocheria for the first time, where he is going to do some training and find out about the other half of his family, his Rocherian roots. Colony members had unloaded all of the trade goods and reloaded their baskets with another time-frame supply of plastic when Rick arrived to greet Arthur and Henry. "Sorry I'm late," he said, breathing heavily. "I had to finish an article for tomorrow morning's city bulletin. We get fired if we're late, or we get fined, not fired. I got bogged down checking out some facts." "Don't worry about it. We had to finish loading anyway." Arthur greeted Rick in the way of ants, both front pods extended. Rick grasped Arthur's outstretched paws and pulled him close. He turned to Henry and offered the same greeting. "I've waited a long time for the privilege of being your temporary family while you train here. Welcome." Henry responded, "I've waited a long time too. Thank you. It's good to be here." He turned and embraced his brother. "Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. Tell David I promise not to get into any trouble." And then as they're leaving, Rick led Henry through the din and confusion. He looked about, taking it all in, excitement surging through him. Larger roaches labored to load huge rolling carts. Some with authority checked off lists on parchment and wrote down destination orders. "This way," said Rick, leading him towards the raised platform at one end of the pavilion. Henry saw a large roach standing there, a round medallion signifying roach board membership around his head dangled below his mandibles. He watched all the activity below and gave instructions to other authority figures. Rick walked up the ramp, lowered his head, and swept out his front pods to the sides. "Good afternoon, sir. I work for the city bulletin. Do you have any public information today?" "Have I seen you before?" "Yes, sir, frequently." "I thought you looked familiar." "No, not today. Stop by 5th day. I'll have this time frame's totals on the regular report for you," he said, turning to another roach and never acknowledging Henry's presence. The two went down the ramp and left the trade center. And then it goes on from there to describe some street scenes and other things that are totally new to Henry and totally new to my readers because we haven't spent so much time in Rocheria before. Later on, as Henry is entering roach training, which is, yeah, well, you'll see, it's different from the from the ants. Henry looked at the title of the manuscript in front of him. Roach Story, from the beginning of organized Roacheria to the 100th season cycle. Trainer Renard called the names of those enrolled in this required unit. Henry Roach Derrier, he heard. Yes, Trainer Renard. Henry rose, stooped, and swept his front paws out to the side. What kind of moronic, plastic, depraved name is Henry Roach Derrier? Trainer Renard asked, raising to his full height. One of the larger variety of roaches, he towered over Henry. With all due respect, I've chosen to acknowledge both sides of my heritage, Henry replied, keeping his voice as steady as he could. A roar of laughter swept through the chamber. Renard raised a paw. Instant silence. And what might that be? I'm a member of New Sarthere Colony 50 and the son of one who was adopted by ants. I'm proud of that, so I chose to declare it with my name. Henry's brothers had hidden themselves behind common roach names while in Roacheria and advised him to do the same. Henry had decided to do the opposite. Trainer Renard looked at him skeptically and moved on down the list. Midday came. Henry took the bowl of food and the mug handed to him by a scrawny male. Thank you, he said. He heard the stunned worker mutter, you're welcome. He turned and headed for a bench at one of the many eating surfaces in the large chamber. May I join you? He asked the groups already seated. Well, well, said Reese, a male of the large type, always found in positions of power. If it isn't Henry hyphenated, so what do you really consider yourself? A roach or a three-blobbed only fit for slavery ant? Maybe he's a rant, taunted another sitting next to him. Henry sat down and let the silence settle before saying, I've been trying to think of a good word for myself for a long time. Rant. Interesting. Thank you. All of them, obviously expecting an angry response to their insults, stared in silence. Henry picked up his mug, raised it toward them in a silent gesture of approval, and ate his lunch without another word, shaking inside like a leaf in a summer storm. He lifted up silent thoughts of meditation that his decision to meet their bigotry and insults head on would not prove to be foolish. And that compared to the great contrast. And so I hope you've been able to see from some of these examples how you can set up an entirely different world that reflects the world we live in while entertaining your reader with a good story. I'd like to go ahead and kind of turn it over to questions at this point and just some open dialogue of what other people have done with setting.
So it sounds like what you've really embraced is cultural setting, not just setting as geography, which, I mean, this.
Correct, because that's the cultural setting is a part of any novel, whether it's contemporary or historic or science fiction. It's part of your characters, it's part of who they are. And in writing a good novel, you have to bring that out.
Cool.
But Debbie, I think two questions.
Sure.
One, clearly you did an enormous amount of research and a lot of thinking to set all of this up. My two questions are, how much time did you take to do that? And did you feel like you had sort of that all completed before you began to write? Or did it happen simultaneously, or how did you go?
A little of both. I had a lot of the world of ant story and roach story. I had a lot of it set up in my mind before I began to write, but it also evolved as I went through the process. The first one that I wrote, this one, which actually ended up the middle. Yeah, Star Wars can do it, so can I. This one took me 3 years and probably 20 rewrites. The second one, which went back a generation to the parents of the first one, took 2 years and probably 15 rewrites. The third one took 1 year and about 10 rewrites. So I got better at it as I was going along. And then the fourth one took longer just because I made it take longer because I kept fighting my characters. I told myself I was not going to write a fourth book, and I kept telling Henry Roach Derrier II to shut up in my mind, and he wouldn't. So he made me write another whole book, which is a bad thing when your characters take over your mind that much and start telling you what to do. So yeah, it was a little of both. Part of it was planning, part of it was research, and part of it was evolving as I went through the series.
Thank you.
Debbie, I have a
Debbie,
question.
oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
You had said that you, when you were describing the calendar, and you talked about Last Day, and you said that didn't come in until one of your second or third books. How did you connect the reader with that information if, you know, that was in a different book?
In the first book that I wrote, I talked about time frames and 4 quarter time frames, and I talked about a year, but not necessarily the length of it. I really didn't need to. So as you read the first book, you got an idea from the context of what their year was. But I didn't have any of the religious ceremonies and things. The first religious ceremony came in this one. And then the way I described it was just have a little bit of backstory within each one. And of course, you've got the myth in every one, so that when I needed to talk about what actual date it was, or that this was Last Day, my readers got a sense of that without it being described as not a day of the week. You know, it's like with us, you know, Christmas is on a different day of the week every year. With them, it's always the same. And so I used more context to describe that, so that each book has in it what you need for that particular plot, but they do tend to build on each other a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Debbie, I was wondering, because this is something I struggle with in writing my own books. When you write about the UP, to what degree do you, how detailed do you feel you need to be? Like, to what degree do you think your readers, you assume that your readers are from the UP and they know what you're talking about? And to what degree do you think, oh, I have to, you know, explain this because someone in California might be reading this book that's never been to the UP? So how do you balance that?
That was a tricky thing that I did with Living on Sisu, because that was the first one that I wrote that involved the UP, but that I hoped would have a readership beyond that. And so I would use little bits here and there, just a touch. Like my opening scene, Emma starts out, and you're reading her journal. And it starts out on May 1st. I am 12 years old today. It has been a wonderful day. Even the sun helped, and it was most welcome. Winter is always long in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, but this year it was especially so because we had snow and sleet even in April. And just that one sentence informed readers outside the UP that, yeah, there are long winters. And then little bits here and there, I would say something in regard, but I would put a sentence or two that would connect with readers who are not from out here. And in the very opening pages of the book, in a little square, I put a definition of the word Sisu, because that's always a problem. Even some people in the UP don't know that. So right at the very beginning, I had, you know, a discussion of the word Sisu. And so I just put little things here and there throughout the book that would help a non-UP reader understand the story a little bit better. And sometimes when I'm down in Texas and I'm describing this book, I say, this is Michigan's Alamo, because it was a changing point in history that affected not only a state, but the nation as a whole, as the Alamo was a turning point for Texas that became known throughout the country. So I did little things like that that would help non-UP readers or non-Michiganders connect. Little short things here and there.
Okay.
It is tricky though. We are a whole different world up here.
Right.
Yeah,
Thank
we
you.
are our own culture in an awful lot of different ways. Any other questions out there or comments or how you've handled setting in various books? I know Donna Winters has done a huge amount with setting, and I respect your techniques, Donna.
Well, thank you very much. And I guess when I started my Great Lakes series, I wasn't, hold on, I'm gonna do the video. See if I can start the video. Okay, maybe I can get it. No, it's not, oh, there we go. Ah, here I am. So with my Great Lakes Romances series, where the setting, every book had some kind of a Great Lakes setting. Actually, when I started the series, I was such a novice writer that I didn't know some really gifted writer said, well, you know, every great or every novel starts with character. I never did. I always went to the setting I was trying to expose and figured out through research who was operating in that particular setting. So, setting was always the backbone for any story I chose.
I really agree, especially with anything historical, as many of your Great Lakes romances are. Your reader has got to know right up front if they're not in the present. Now, if you're a contemporary fiction writer, you can start with character because we know the setting is contemporary. But anytime you're not in the present day, you've got to start with your setting. I know Tyler's dealt with that too, with all of your historical stuff and with your
Yeah, I haven't really
the
thought about
Alfred's,
it in
yeah,
that
King Arthur's
respect.
children stuff.
Mhm.
My
I'm not-
husband had a question. He's not
Mhm.
he's not in the video, but his question is, because you've created a different world, did or do you find yourself constantly questioning societal norms?
Oh, yes.
Mhm.
Like from
Yeah,
the
there's a great deal of social satire in the Chronicles of Henry Roach Derrier, just huge amount of social satire. One of my reviewers early on referred to my books as Animal Farm and Watership Down rolled into one, which sent my ego up about 100 points, because to be compared to George Orwell, and I forget the author of Watership Down, but to two, classic writers, I thought, yes. So, yeah.
Debbie, I had another question. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
So I related to my question before, you did a lot of research, you set things up, you had lots of things established in your mind, and then things evolved. Did you
Mhm.
have points where you sort of painted yourself into a corner?
Yes. And then I had to go back and do a lot of rewriting.
Mm.
You know, sometimes I would change something in book 3, because when I first did it, they all came out in one, the first 3 came out in this one massive volume all at once.
Oh,
It
okay.
was a disaster, which is why I separated them.
Oh,
But as I was writing the 3rd book, I would talk about something and I'll say, oh crap, this
Mhm.
never came into the other ones. So
Mm.
I'd have to go back and stick something into a scene in one or the other of the first 2. So yeah, that did come into it. And
So-
even within the same novel, sometimes I had to go back and rewrite a scene or insert a scene in an earlier part because, oh, I left that out. I need to describe that better. Or my critique partners would bring it out to me and say, what? You know, what are you doing here? What happened to that? What you know, did I miss something? And I'd realize, oh yeah, it was up here, but it didn't make it onto the page.
Mhm, mhm.
So yes, I have painted myself into many corners.
Debbie, is there a difference in how you'd approach like a middle grade novel versus a novel for adults in terms of setting, or is it really all the same tools?
Yes. When you, not so much in terms of describing the setting, but in the overall tone of the book, fewer complex sentences, not so much a limited vocabulary, but you have to think what the age level you're writing for and writing for young people, what terms they are used to and what would be like way over their heads. There's a really good resource book for that called the Children's Writer's Word Book. And you can look up a word in it and it'll give you the average age range that a kid should be familiar with that particular term. And then a second part of the book is like a thesaurus, where if, say I chose a word that's on a 5th to 6th, you know, let's say maybe on a high school level, but I'm really aiming it at 4th graders, I could look in another section and it would suggest other words that, synonyms that were a little bit simpler. And in the beginning, I used a lot of that, but basically you just read a lot. I read a lot of children's books. I read a lot of adult stuff. And in children's work, the paragraphs are shorter, the chapters are shorter. The dialogue is not as long. It's, you know, you have to listen to the way kids talk too. And it is, one thing that's good is older readers can always read a younger book. An adult can read and enjoy a middle grade novel. In fact, I enjoy an awful lot of them, especially the Newbery Award winners every year, which are, you know, border between middle grade and young adult. And by just reading a lot of whatever your target audience is going to be, you can get a feel for that very easily and adjust accordingly. I often tell people, you know, when they say, oh, you write for kids, I say, that doesn't mean adults can't read it. It just means kids can. And then they realize, oh yeah, you know, it all boils down to the age of the character. If you're writing for middle grade, you want to have your main character at the top of that. You want to have them like 11 or 12.
Right.
Because kids like to read about somebody that's their age or a little bit older. They do not, in general, want to read about somebody younger. So you don't have a 6-year-old main character in a middle grade chapter book.
Right.
I mean, it has to really be something unusual to get away with that. And in a young adult book, you want them late middle school to high school in age or upper teens. Hunger Games is a really good example of that.
Mm-hmm.
The main characters in those books are all, they're teenagers, 15, 16, some of them only 14. You know, and that's what draws in the younger readers is the age of the character. Now, a lot of people in SCBWI will tell you that too, the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators.
Right, I've heard that before. I've had some first-time children's book authors. I wasn't, monitoring the text as closely as I should. And
Mhm.
eventually we sent them all to Lexile Corporation, which scores them a 3-digit score for what age they are. And a
Yeah,
few of them we thought were for first, second, third ended up about 3 years above where they should be because of the vocabulary.
yeah. And it's not that you don't have some, say, second, third graders who can read at that level, because you do,
Mhm.
but you have more that aren't. And so
Yeah.
you kind of have to hit the middle of it.
Yeah. I think that first, second grade is a really hard grade for people to have that kind of control so that it's accessible to that age group as readers.
Yes, yeah. And whenever I'm writing for that age group, and I don't do that very often, that's where I relied so heavily on that children's writer's word book. And that's out from, Writer's Digest. They have so many really good reference books for writers that cover topics, weird topics like that. They just have it on the shelf and you pull it out when you need it. And after a while, you don't need it as much. But I think my teaching background has also helped me with that too, because I have a broad range in my teaching experience and my teaching certification, so that teachers have a natural feel for that sort of thing that others might not have. And the only way to get that, if you're not a teacher, is to read about 100 kids' books that are aimed at the age level that you want to appeal to. And the easy way to do that is walk into your local library and say, I'm looking for books that appeal to such and such grade level. And they'll say, sure, here, boom. Hand you half a dozen to start with. But that's really a good way to get a feel for it if you want to be writing for children. And that goes for adults too. Read a lot of adult fiction if you want to write adult fiction. I meet some people, I have this really good idea. How do you write a novel? I say, well, what do you like to read? Oh, I don't read. You don't read, but you want to write, And I'm sure some of the other writers here have heard things like that, and you want to say, yeah, don't quit your day job. In fact, don't quit your day job anyway until you can retire from it. A little humor gets us a long way in this business, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Anything else? I think we've about used up our time frame, haven't we, Victor?
Yeah, we're pretty much at the end, and I want to thank everybody for showing up on a cold winter evening and spending some time with us learning about setting. I know I learned a great deal, and I hope everyone else did as well. Thank you.
Deb.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
Debbie, for your
Have a
time.
good evening. Stay warm.
Thank
Okay.
you so
Thank
much.
you, thank you.
Thank
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.